Was there anything else, Brittany, that I'm forgetting norms-wise?
Just that when you tell a story, please keep everybody anonymous.
Oh,
Um,
yes, thank you.
and these are the thoughts of the individual, not the district that the individual works for. And we are recording. This recording is going to be sent to people who couldn't make it to the meeting. Um, I will send them when they request it. It's not going to be put out on the group Facebook page. There's a Google Slides document that, and there's a Google Slides document and a Word or Google Doc that was linked to the event invite. The Google Doc has definitions and also the guest information. The Google Slides should be used as a resource dump. If you find something, think of something, you want to add it to the resource, you want to add it to that Google slide, just go ahead, add a slide, and then add your resource. It's a good thing if you write your questions down. It's just a suggestion so you don't forget, or your comments. And I think that's it. We're good to start.
Awesome. Oh, and then one more thing real quick, because feedback on Zoom can get a little wonky, just please make sure your mics are on mute unless you're speaking. And that will just help cut down on some of the feedback, especially since we're going to be recording. And other than that, we're good to go. All right, so I'll go ahead and start our opening comments. Oh, Brittany, go ahead.
Dana, you have your hand raised on the Zoom app. Do you have something to say?
No.
Okay,
How
I'm
do
gonna
I
lower
get it
your
up?
hand.
How do I get, there you go. It went. It's
Yep.
gone.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'll lower the hands. Sorry about that.
Thank you. Awesome. All right, so we're going to get started in our work this evening. So as we prepare to jump into the discussion tonight, I want to just remind everyone that we are here to take a learner stance in all ways, especially if this is your first time engaging in this kind of work. We're going to be talking a lot about anti-racist pedagogy. We're going to be talking directly about white privilege, racism, discrimination. We're going to be getting into all of that. So I just want to make sure everyone is aware this work can be uncomfortable. Brittany and I have both been in these kinds of discussions for the first time at some point, and we will both tell you it is hard, it is uncomfortable, and it is okay. I'm asking that everyone trust this process and focuses on action in this space rather than feelings. So that is really our goal, to take what we learn from this conversation and turn it into hopefully actionable policy that will impact people's lives in a positive way. All right. All right, so we're going to jump in with our first question this evening. And again, just put your raise hand feature up when you are ready to share your thoughts. So the first question, and these are also in the Google Doc, if you have that up on your own, just so you can reference back and forth. The questions are at the top. Oh, Brittany, did you want to go over the definitions first, or just let people kind of read over those if they need to?
If you have trouble getting that Google Doc, if you don't see a Google Doc that has definitions, please in the chat box get my attention, and I will make sure that you have that link so you can read the definitions for yourself.
Great, because Brittany provided us with some really great definitions that are grounded in academic work. So I think those definitions are really powerful. If you have time to look through those, it would be really helpful if you can have them up on the side, or I know I have mine up on my phone just to reference back and forth. So just so that you have that. So our first question this evening is, what are you apprehensive about when talking about race in the classroom with your students and with fellow teachers? And I'll type that question in the chat as well, just to kind of keep things moving.
So for this, we want to think about talking about racism in historical context, talking about it with other teachers, maybe confronting it. Kelsey Smith.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
I think the most basic thing that comes to mind is the fact that I'm typically the only white person in the room and I'm the teacher. So bringing it up to my students, that's one thing that makes me apprehensive.
Okay. Thank you for sharing. Willow?
I have a, can you guys hear me?
Mm-hmm.
I don't have a problem talking about race in classrooms. As when I was teaching and also as a guest teacher, substitute teacher, because I'm Black. So there's no issues on there because I'm Black and I'm talking to Black kids. It's the white kids that have a problem with the race thing. And I actually, there's a school district that I'm excluded from subbing in based on a white girl's interpretation of a conversation, and she went to go tell one of the white one of the white counselors, and then that white counselor went to the principal, who was Hispanic, and came back and asked me what happened, and I told him, and I ended up being later on, I was excluded from subbing at that school because of how sensitive the white girl took my comments, and she took them out of context, and it became like she was just really unhappy with what I said. So she felt, and I think she was, usually when kids do certain things, they're problematic students anyway. And as a substitute, a lot of times you'll have problem with kids that are problematic. And so, but we don't have that history of them. But usually I found that when I do have issues, it's usually a kid that they've been having problems with too. And so, I tend to believe that that was probably with her as well, or that she had anger management or mental health issues. But by the discussion that we had in the class of Blacks and Hispanics didn't have a problem with it. It was the white girl, and after the conference I had with the principal, which was also in the classroom, and it was an appropriate place for us to talk. I found out like 2 days later that I was excluded from subbing at that school. And so it's not that I have a problem talking to students, it's who's the students I'm talking to it about. And when you're dealing with white people, you're dealing with, like you said, their emotions. And that's why Black people have a hard time communicating with white people with race, because they get caught up in their emotions, and then they start to cry or they disagree with you, and they want you to see it their way, and they don't see it any other way but their view, and there is what prevents the communication. And then white teachers that I have encountered that have issues talking about race or teaching subjects that are race-based, it's just the fact that I think a lot of times they have their established views of Blacks or other people of color, and that, or their stereotypes, and that also makes them uncomfortable to speak, because now they're trying to say what's politically correct. But they're also biased and racist in their own white identity. And so they're very uncomfortable trying to talk about that subject or any subjects or anything that has to do with Blacks, not understanding that they're only giving their view and their knowledge and haven't been exposed. So however they're going to say it is not going to come out right.
Okay. Thank you for sharing,
for
Dana.
sharing.
Willow.
I think something that makes me apprehensive is that I feel like right now I'm in a really big kind of growing period where I'm reading a lot and I'm watching a lot, and my first instinct is to ask questions of those around me. Whether it's a student, me asking them, is this something that you see happening at school? Or is this something you encounter with your friends? And they may, sometimes it seems like they're scared to tell me yes or no, especially if it's me asking them, do you see this with teachers at school? Because, they think they're going to get in trouble. So I definitely think, Dana, what you just said about pre-established views or stereotypes, I definitely think that that's something I'm still trying to fight against right now, as I grew up in a mostly white city. And so I'm retraining my brain at the same time. So trying to have those conversations with students that are then asking me questions and I'm asking the same questions. It's like I'm apprehensive because I don't have the answers for them, or I don't feel that it's appropriate sometimes for me to answer some of those questions either.
Thank you, Willow. I think Myra, you were next. You're muted, Myra.
How's that? Yeah, okay. Willow, for you and anyone else out there, when you do feel that apprehension, I think it's okay to let the student know, look, I don't know all the answers, but I will try to figure it out for you. One of the biggest things that I see that is a problem is that when people not of color will say, well, I don't see color. Well, see, I have a problem with that, because when you say that, then you're negating who I am, because you can't deny that I am a person of color, that I'm a Black person, I'm an African American. That's the first thing you see. And you have to acknowledge what you see and let, that is good, that is right, that is okay. And even you have to do that with the students also, because they have all these preconceived notions, as Dana said, based on what they've seen on TV or what they've heard their parents say, or what's in the social media that's not necessarily true. And then the part of that's a problem is students now, and I don't want to just generalize, but I know that children nowadays don't have the same background as some of us who are older may have had in being raised in a civil rights era, or coming up in the 70s where, my parents had to talk with me when you're in public, where to put your hands, even when you're driving, So the apprehension, no, I'm not apprehensive, to talk about the issue, but the other person you're speaking to has to be open. And then as for us who are speaking, we just have to put it out there. And there's no fear behind it, because this is who we are. This is what it is.
Myra, I love that you said just to admit your apprehension to students, because they will receive it so well. If you just admit, I'm coming from a space of white privilege and I don't understand all the issues, but I will work and help you figure this out. I love it. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Debbie Shutama?
Shutama.
I'm sorry.
It's a rough one to pronounce. It's just like school, the SCH. Thank you for everyone who's shared so far. And I think, so I work a lot more with adults as teachers in my role. Talk to kids all the time, and I feel like that's a little bit different relationship when it's teachers and you're in the lunchroom and you work in a school with primarily students who are Black and brown, and some of the conversation, it just brings out what people are valuing and stereotypes that they hold. And so to challenge those, it is scary. And so I think sometimes I'm apprehensive because I still have to work with these people every day, but this is not okay because of who we are teaching and who we serve. And so bringing some things up still do it, but don't always have the words or what I'm looking for. I might get stuck in the emotion versus, I guess they just get nervous about thinking, what can I say to help push someone into thinking about what they're doing affects the kids in the classroom. And that work is really hard because I still have some defensiveness myself at different times. And so if you read White Fragility and you read all the different ways that we can be defensive when it comes to being challenged in certain regard, you see it. Myra, just like you said, people say, well, I don't see color, so it's not a problem for me. And you're like, no, that is the problem. Mm-hmm. So I guess I get apprehensive because I feel like I don't have the right things to say on the fly. And I know that doesn't mean you should still stay silent. So just working on more strategies and things to say or places to direct people, because follow-up is another hard thing to do. So maybe you started a conversation, but coming back to it is really important in the workplace.
Yeah.
I guess I'm hoping to get more strategies and just keep pushing myself to get past the fear of saying something.
Thank you, Debbie. It's confrontation, and confrontation is an emotional experience, which limits our ability to articulate like exactly what we want to say. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, and I love what you said about that defensiveness. That's definitely a daily conversation with ourselves, right? Like we have to catch ourselves when we feel that defensiveness and immediately address it. And that takes a lot of self-awareness and a lot of work. So thank you for saying that.
I kind of want to spin off what Debbie said. Strategies, resources, follow-up. If you have anything to share, please raise your hand, share it now, or share it in the chat. Strategies to confront racism in the school. Amari, you are next. A-M-A-R-I-S.
Glamorous.
Sorry.
That's okay. Rhymes with glamorous, then people don't forget it.
Okay.
What I just really wanted to bring to the conversation was I work in early childhood, and it's something, the whole topic doesn't really come up at all in any of our trainings with administrators. We don't really ever talking about race with the kids at all. And I feel like part of the reason is that I think we're kind of in a situation where parents still feel like they have so much say in what goes on in the classroom, and there's a segment of parents that don't want it to come up. And I don't think we're doing our kids a service by that. You know, this is the ground floor of introducing education and, you know, the schooling to children. And I would love to see that change, because there's so much positive impact we could have and so many great discussions you can have with young children, and they're not too young. And so there, you know, with all the complex issues, that's one thing I've noticed as I've been thinking, is that this doesn't even really come up in the really, really early years, when you could really start to also challenge families to think a little bit different. And maybe some of it is because there's the apprehension and awkwardness too. But so I would love if people have resources or advice about maybe how we can start to change that thinking a little bit in that segment of education.
I'm just writing a few things you said down. Thank you. It's amorous, right? Amorous? Okay. Challenging thinking resources. All right. Thank you. Kevin.
Yeah. So I had a feeling that I would be sitting in this conversation and not really have much to offer because of all of the insightful perspectives that are present here. I want to reiterate a couple of things. Just for everybody, for a little context, I'm working now primarily with undergraduate teacher candidates at Grand Valley, so people who are going into teaching. In fact, I see a couple of my former undergraduate students here. Of course, Brittany was a grad student that I worked with. So that's kind of the lens that I'm bringing to this. But I want to reiterate a couple of things that I heard already, which were one, authenticity and being real with students about what you know and what you don't know, maybe what you can't know because of your position. I recognized pretty early in my teaching career that I could talk about race because I'm a white male, and people are going to receive what I'm saying differently than they would if it were coming from a person of color. And so I tried to use that, frankly, as some leverage to invite people into the conversation and to get them to talk about some things that might otherwise be difficult for them to talk about. And I do that partially by telling my own story. You know, I grew up, I was a first generation college student. I grew up in the city of Chicago, which has its own problematic racial dynamics. And sharing, growing up in a blue collar working class family, sharing with students my story of being surrounded by racism and by people with views of the world that I realized later were problematic, but that took me a long time to unpack, and that it's okay. We aren't born into the world knowing and being enlightened about these things, and it takes time and effort to really a lifetime of effort to kind of figure out how those have impacted us and how their impact on us has then in turn impacted others. So I try to be authentic and I try to be real. And I also try to be vulnerable because that's another quality that I think goes far in allowing people to open themselves up to dialogue and to hearing other people. So back to the original question, those are ideas I've heard from others here that I think are really just worth kind of repeating. But to go back to the original question, why are you apprehensive? Well, what I hear most often from pre-service teachers is that they recognize the problematic, traumatic racial history of our country. They see it in the places that they've gone to school themselves, the places that they've worked, but they don't feel like because they themselves have not had much exposure to diversity and maybe have been in very isolated suburban or rural communities, they don't have a place to talk about these issues. So that's one major apprehension I hear from pre-service teachers. It's, well, I don't know anything about this, so therefore I can't talk about it and I can't engage students with it. Building upon something I said about my own kind of pedagogy, it's really difficult, and this is, I've heard other people say this, it's really difficult for people to own their own bias, you know, and to kind of say, you know, this is an inevitable part of growing up in this culture, and I need to recognize where it plays out in my life, where I see it showing up, and kind of pick that apart, and again, you know, make myself vulnerable. So people just, you know, as several people have said, are afraid to own it, to talk about it, and to say that because, you know, they're afraid of being labeled a racist, frankly. And then the third thing that I hear from pre-service teachers primarily is, oh, you know, I teach white kids, so we don't have to really talk about race. And that's a problem for so many. I mean, that's really where the conversations need to be happening, is what I try to tell them. But initially they're thinking, you know, some people have alluded to this colorblind attitude. It's not an issue where I teach, so therefore I don't need to talk about it. So just a few thoughts and experiences from my work with teacher candidates.
Thank you for sharing, Kevin. That was really awesome.
All right, Maleika.
So I'm kind of going to go back and forth. So not necessarily answering the question totally, but maybe a little bit alluding to it. But as I was listening to everyone talk, one thing kept coming up for me, and that I call it the journey to self. So there's an author named Gary Howard He wrote, oh man, my age is showing. We can't teach what we don't know. And in the very first part of that book, he really shares his journey to getting to know himself. And I say that because, you know, as educators, white educators of Black and brown students, before you can really engage in having a conversation about race or answering students' questions, it's important that you begin to know, really investigate yourself. So, you know, who am I? I always say, who am I and what am I bringing into this workspace? And so once you can wrap your head around that, and it's not, I mean, I'm still along the journey. So when Kevin talked about telling a story, storytelling is powerful. But you have to be able to write that story or have this conversation with yourself about your story. What things made you the person you are? Right, wrong, or indifferent. And then once you know that, you'll be able to identify when that shows up in your classroom, in your conversations with others, and then, I guess, so to speak, check yourself. The second thing that I wanted to talk about is, I think it's Zerretta Hammond has a mindfulness protocol. I'll try to go back and find it, Brittany, and send it to you. But she does it in terms of when you are talking to another person about something that you've identified as being hurtful to a student or another person. Basically, you want to intervene. You want to have this conversation about race. And she gives all these prompts that you ask, you know, can, you know, repeat what you said, tell me what happened. So it's almost like you're having, sometimes in your classroom, you have this conversation with your students, tell me what happened. Why did that happen? What were you thinking? But you're having that with another adult. And that is a really good way of starting that conversation. And then that leads me to, I put it in the chat, my team and I have been studying Glenn Singleton's Courageous Conversations about Race. And it really kind of encapsulates having those conversations. And one of those things that he really talks about is understanding what your triggers are also, as you move into these conversations. And so that's it for now.
All right. Thank you, Maleika. That's great. I actually looked up, you said Zerretta Hammond, Mindfulness Protocol. Thank you. Katie Lewis.
Okay, I apologize if this is a little rambly, but it kind of touches on, I feel like, some different things people have mentioned. I teach 3rd and 4th grade students with special needs, and for us, we're learning about what their civil rights are, and this year I kind of use that as a jumping off point to kind of, you know, introduce important figures from Black history. But I know, like, obviously I want to have these conversations and do them justice for my students, but I think it's hard for them because, you know, in that framework, they feel so far removed from it, I think. You know, they will say, Miss Lewis, so it's stupid that people think, you know, they thought that Rosa couldn't sit farther up in the bus just because she's Black. That's so dumb. But I want them to be able to see that, you know, these things are still happening today and are affecting a huge majority of people in our world. And I think also, like, just balancing with, I had one African American student in my class this year, and he was so excited. He said, Miss Lewis, these people we're talking about, like, they look like me. And he was so excited, and I like thought that was an awesome moment, and I want more of those, but I want it to be like, do it justice, and like I want it to seem genuine, you know, not just like I'm talking about it because we have to, or, you know, based on the makeup of the group or what have you, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a really awesome thought, to make sure that you're building that into your educational routines with students so that it's enough of a regular conversation. Your students will feel safer in that space, and it will feel like a routine. It won't feel like something we're just diverging from the curriculum to address. It will be just part of how you teach your class.
I'm on mute. I'm sorry. David Pham.
Hello. I may not be a teacher, but as a high school student at my school, personally, I feel like I've gone to a charter school for kindergarten to middle school, and for high school right now as a sophomore, I'm going to a prep net school. And when I've seen these two, like I compared the schools together, most of the teachers I've seen are white teachers. I've rarely seen any people of color teachers, any Black teachers, Hispanic teachers. And one thing I do notice is that in my high school, even though it's very diverse, we have, like, it's in a way equal of people of diversity there. But for teachers, they're all white. Even if they're Hispanic, they pass as white. I could have, like, my Spanish teacher, she's Mexican, but she looks white. I have my, yeah. And so then one thing I try to do, because when I try to talk to them and like the subject of racism pops up out of nowhere, like I try to have like this conversation, like a genuine, just real one-on-one conversation, you know? And I feel like they try to hide behind the school. I feel like they're scared to even just speak up about it because like it's a private school, like private owned. They feel like they're gonna get attacked from the school or they're gonna get fired or anything. And sometimes what I try to do is like, don't worry, this is just between us. This is not gonna come out just like that. I'm not gonna tell everybody. But what I feel like one thing I wanna work on personally with schools and teachers is that it's okay to open up. If you get fired or anything, you can get another job. It may be hard, but it's better to get fired when you want to stand up and make a change for real 100% equality change than getting fired for just staying quiet and complicit.
Thank you, David. I think that's an important point, is that white privilege is very rooted to the point where we become like, we don't want to talk about it because we could be reprimanded or we could lose our job, and it needs to be that idea needs to be pushed back on. Thank you again. Myra? I don't know.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. First of all, hi, Miss Lewis, because we all work together. Going back to what Miss Lewis was saying, one problem that I've always had with schools is that, Black history truly is only taught during the month of February. And then, of course, schools always come out with the same people, Martin Luther King, et cetera. Now, granted, there's nothing wrong with that because they are the forefathers of our civil rights era. But we need to look deeper. And in terms of being, supported in the school, we do have other staff of color in the building. And I don't think there's anything wrong with asking a staff person to come in, hey, can you come in and talk to the kids? Because I think that they need to see that we're not just here, walking around being educators or social workers, what have you, but we're here to help one another also and to encourage and support one another. So I think that would be a good thing. If there is someone that's Black that you can bring to talk to the kids, that would help also. Another thing I wanted to say too is, yes, there's so many books out there and we go to conferences, etc. But it's always about what do we do next? I think we have to be very careful in reading everything and then over strategizing. Because when you start strategizing everything you've read, okay, I read in this book, I read in that book, then you become a robot and then you become ungenuine. Just, to the kids will point that out. Yes, read information, take it in, synthesize it for yourself, but then speak from the heart. As the kids say, be real about it, be 100, because they will pick up on that very, very quickly.
Thank you, Myra. Kevin?
I was thinking again about some of the pushback that I get from primarily white young undergraduates who are interested in becoming, or who are in the process of becoming teachers. And one of those is rooted in our discussions around how, particularly in schools, there's a tendency for schools via the curriculum, via the pedagogy, via the institution itself to reproduce inequality, right? When you see, for example, only the culture and experiences of white people reflected in the curriculum, that's going to put you a step behind if you're not a part of that. If you're not a part of that culture, so we kind of deconstruct the dominant culture. We also talk about the fact that oftentimes kids of color and other marginalized groups are having to, they have a couple of choices. One, they can assimilate to that dominant culture. They can learn to play by the rules. They can learn the codes and the culture of power and use that to navigate their way through the systems. A second option, of course, is for students or young people to reject that culture for a variety of legitimate reasons, but thereby put themselves at a disadvantage when it comes to advancing academically, professionally, et cetera. And I put out a third option because often when I kind of present that choice to these pre-service teachers, they obviously don't want to do one or the other. I don't want to force kids to assimilate to this dominant culture that we've been deconstructing, but I also don't want them to push back against it so hard that they're putting themselves at this distinct disadvantage, right? So the third option I tell them is to be honest, to talk about the culture of power, to call it what it is, to identify how it plays out in schools, and then invite kids to know it, but also to challenge it. And that's very difficult for especially young idealistic teachers to do, because what they imagine they're doing is actually telling kids, when I say be honest, they imagine they're telling kids that they're not going to make it. And that's not what I'm telling them to tell kids. I'm telling them to tell kids what many of these kids already know, which is the fact that because of the institutions and the history, they are at a disadvantage, but then they have a choice in that. And I think it's the same reason that a lot of white people have such trouble admitting to and talking about privilege. It's because we've been inculcated with this narrative of the individual is responsible for themselves, right? This kind of pull yourselves up by your bootstraps story that we've been telling since the beginnings of this country. And it really kind of, it flies right in the face of that. So my point, I guess, is I think it's always useful and in developmentally appropriate ways to be honest with kids and not to pretend like we live in a society where everybody has an equal shot.
Thank you, Kevin.
Can I say something?
Mm-hmm.
I want to hit on some of what the other people have spoken in reference to what Myra said about the kids are not coming from a tradition of where their family members talked about race or the civil rights movement to them. One of the things that we're told coming up that kids aren't told today is that we have to work twice as hard, 3 times as hard as white kids do or white people do just to be recognized for what we do. White people don't have to work hard because they're automatically in that group, that culture that's going to make that decision that they're qualified just because they're white. And regarding what Kevin said, and I shared this with Brittany when we spoke on the phone, that when I was in Grand Valley School of Education, one of my professors told me, he said that one of the problems they had was how to help the white students once they get in the classroom. He says, because as white kids, they're A students, they're book students. They get great grades on what we teach them from the book, but they don't know how to translate what they learn from the book in the classroom. And that's because of their cultural biasness. I also told Brittany that I have had conversations with teachers, because I tell a lot of times people that really teachers are really dumb. And they're like, huh? And I said, well, think about it. The most experience they had with kids, or traditionally, is that they were babysitters, or a lot of kids in their family. And so when they said, well, what am I gonna do to go to college? They said they want to be a teacher. Well, most of the kids in your family are gonna be white kids. And people that you're gonna babysit is gonna be white kids. And you might have had friends that were in school, but you really weren't friends where you really hung out, spent the night, ate dinner with them type of friends. It was just friendships at school, and they ended at school. So when you are in the classroom and you're trying to apply all that classroom management that they really emphasize, because they know that white teachers are getting their butts kicked in the classroom because of classroom management, they don't know how to make it work in the real world. And that's where they saw that they were failing the Black kids, because they couldn't handle the classroom, because they weren't used to being around kids of color. And that's why they have to do their student assisting and student teaching in classes, in schools that are not of their race, so that they could get that exposure. But that little time of exposure is not enough. So the expectations when they're going through school and everything is that they're going to be in a classroom full of white kids that look like them. So they'll be able to culturally identify with them when they're in the classroom. But what the reality is not enough schools that need white teachers. Most of the schools need teachers that are going to be in classrooms with those that are of color. And that's when mentally they freak out. Because I have a whole classroom full of Black kids, and I've never been around Black people my whole freaking life. What am I going to do? I don't know how to handle it. And then their cultural standards of how we say that white people are more structured and conservative and disciplined, whereas Black people we're more lively and expressive, physically and verbally, that conflicts with how white people traditionally grow up. So then you're trying to manage a class, and then that's when you bring in the punishment, the unnecessary punishment, put them out of school, which leads to school to prison pipeline, where don't know how to talk to Black people when you're dealing with Black parents who, we as Black people, we know how we come represented at school, and we have to deal with that as well. But for a white person, that is, you can't wrap your head around it. So that leads to, with the low expectations of the students, you have low expectations of the parents, and then you're in a constant battle of trying to control your class so that you can teach. And they spend a lot of their time doing that and not actually really teaching. Or if they really are a good teacher, they never really get to really let that be shown, because they're in a constant battle with classroom discipline. And then I think Amars was talking about being comfortable talking about race. And one of the things that as Black people, we're noticing that there's now a push to allow the gay and lesbian curriculum to be taught in school, to have acceptance in school, but they haven't even learned how to teach Black history. So it's like a joke, like they haven't even taught Black history right, but now they're gonna push in, a gay curriculum, but that also aligns to the culture of white people, so that's more comfortable to talk about than race. And then another point I wanted to make was, let me see, sorry.
No, you're fine.
Oh, when you go to, when you do have other Black teachers in the classroom, one of the issues that you may not, they're a good resource, but they also may look at you coming to them as, we're not here to do your job. We're teaching and we got our job to do, and I have a colleague that is asking me to do their job or their work for them, and that's an extra burden on them in light of what they're already doing. Another teacher is coming for me to help them with their job. Now, I'm just putting that out there. I'm not necessarily saying that is how we feel, but just be aware of that when you reach out. If you don't keep burdening them with trying to help you. I'm not saying don't reach out. I'm just saying don't keep coming back, because a lot of it is your problem and not their problem. And there's no way that a Black person can fix the reason why you can't teach your kids or you're uncomfortable about race.
Thank you, Dana. I want to kind of touch on what you said with Black history not being taught properly. I think that in my experience, Black history taught within the curriculum really doesn't tie to how white people allowed the atrocities against the civil rights movement during slavery. When we talk about slavery, we kind of queued it up, like make it campy, so it's easier for white America to swallow. There's no direct line from kind of the atrocities that happened in history and to white people. Just like there isn't really a direct line to Black history or the civil rights movement and the white allies and how those white people had to actually take action. And it leaves a question to be had in the classroom that, or not a question to be had. It leaves this this absence, like who was responsible for this? How has this history impacted white America today and Black America today? Like, how does that create the system of white supremacy? And I think that Black History Month, if that's the only time you're teaching Black history, well, white supremacy needs to be in that conversation. Systemic racism needs to be a part of that conversation. And how is systemic racism and white supremacy being upheld today? Yeah, so those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Brittany.
Yeah.
I just want to add on to what you said very briefly. I find that as a teacher, when you do this for a while and you start to get more comfortable with it and you start to trust yourself a little bit more, you see the reward so fast with your students. So I just want to say to anyone who's thinking, oh my gosh, I'm never going to get there, I'm never going to feel comfortable having these conversations, please try. Get support, get a buddy, get someone that you trust to hold you accountable, because when my students know it, when I pull out the globe and I shut the door and I pull the map down and they know I'm about to go off script for a minute to teach them how something historical connected to something else, and I connect that back to what we're talking about. And they love it. But I wasn't there my first year teaching. I wasn't there my second year teaching. It takes practice, it takes time. We're not perfect. I'm certainly not perfect. I'm always still learning. So just please, again, I'm just going to reiterate, trust the process.
So we have a question from the chat room. Kelsey asked, so off of this, do you all think we should teach a Black History Month unit during February or embed it within our current curriculum? Kaylin Williams.
Hi, so if you want to wait, because I wasn't necessarily going to risk time in.
Okay, I'll keep your hand up. Zach?
Okay.
Yeah, so at the school I teach at, I teach African American history and Latin American history as electives. Those names should definitely be changed. I don't know who to talk to about that, but I also teach US history. And going off of that comment, like when I first got my job and I first started teaching those classes, my hometown is white, very white. So I got the white US history education, and especially in college. So when I first started teaching those classes, I did not have the experience. I told all my students that multiple times, almost every single day, that like there's definitely a lot of other people who are more qualified to teach this, who know this a lot better. And I've constantly been learning as I teach those classes, and it's to the point where it's very easy to teach like a US history class and integrate that. I think it should be completely integrated into it. Like US history is, Black history is US history. So just constantly keeping up that drive of like, while you're talking about the Industrial Revolution, just don't be talking about that only, talk about the issues or the successes or whatnot in the United States for the Black or communities of color that are also going through it. It's not just white America who went through it.
Thank you. Zach, right? Zach? Yeah, thank you. So that's something that we will kind of have to do on our own if it's not provided to us by the curriculum. Like, make sure you check your sources, make sure it's factual, but you're going to have to embed it then on your own, and that's our responsibility. Maleika.
I guess I can only just say ditto to what Zach was saying. And I saw in the chat, it doesn't matter if you teach English or math or science or whatever. There are so many ways to integrate African American history into all of those. This is nothing new, but your books have just been whitewashed and they've been chosen that way on purpose. And so just doing a little bit of research, and when you're teaching a book about an era, and maybe it's in English, or you're doing a specific type of writing, you can introduce a topic and have that conversation. And no, just to ditto, while I'm grateful that we have an African American History Month, otherwise in some places it might not ever get mentioned, I believe that it should be integrated throughout the whole year. And so when I send out resources for different monthly celebrations, I always say, you know, here's my little asterisk that we should be doing this throughout the whole year. It should be integrating Native American history, African American history, Hispanic American history, because it's all history, as Mr. Blood said. So,
Thank you, Maleika. So it is 8 o'clock. I'm going to call in the next two people, and then we'll do our closing comments and maybe a Q&A. Kevin?
I was just going to say very briefly that I often have to remind teachers that they don't need to invent this themselves, that there are plenty of resources out there to assist them in doing this kind of work, to integrate the history of marginalized and oppressed groups across the curriculum, across the grades. Going back to some earlier points, you know, I emphasize this should not be confined to high school students. I mean, 6, 7, and 8-year-olds are the most capable of asking the fundamental question, which is why? Why is this happening? Why did this happen? So, you know, I mentioned things like the Zinn Education Project, People's History of the United States, Rethinking Schools, Teaching Tolerance. I mean, there are just a plethora of resources out there that can help people with this. So it's certainly not something you have to figure out on your own.
Kevin, would you mind sharing maybe your top 3, or
right,
in the chat, or just email?
Absolutely, sure.
Thank you so much, and then I can email or send it out to the group. Kaylin?
Sure. I want to celebrating Black people and culture throughout the entire year. And my apprehension, though, it comes more, I feel really comfortable celebrating the beauty of Black people and culture and history and all the many important ways that people have contributed to the way arts and all that. Where I feel more apprehensive, and is when it comes to the teaching the harder things, the Buddhism and the pieces off, and people think, well, they're too young, we don't want to, you know, just lose their innocence. And I don't agree with that. I think that we have to start as white people really young, on learning and unlearning. So
Kaylin, your
attention often comes because I have a really diverse classroom, and I don't want to teach other things. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
No?
The connection is just low. Your bandwidth is low. So
not good. Okay. Okay, you can hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
No. Okay.
Maybe could
I'll try to be quick.
Okay.
I don't want to teach the harder. Yes. Yes. In the chat?
Yeah, if you could type it out in the chat. Thank you
Yes.
everybody for being patient. So I want to just make sure that everybody, while she's typing, if you have not looked at the chat box has resources on teaching, marginalized or people of color, history of people of color, marginalized groups, history, to embed it in our own curriculum, or the curriculum that exists. It's poorly worded, I'm sorry. There is Zerretta Hammond, how to check unconscious bias. I'm also putting these in the slide share. And several other books that were mentioned by Myra and Maleika. So make sure you check that out. And make sure you connect to the slides. So Kaylin says, I don't want to teach the harder parts, racism, violence, oppression, in a way that re-traumatizes my students of color or causes them more stress or fear or sadness. Does anyone have any thoughts, opinions, resources that could speak to how to be considerate of students of color in talking about the most difficult parts or points, especially things that are situations that might have been violent? Myra?
Yes, this is a difficult conversation, but I think not talking about those is what's going to hurt the student. Because either way, the minute a child steps in public, especially a Black child or a brown child, that's what's going to be seen. And I think that they should also be educated. They need to be educated on what's going to happen, what can happen, what has happened in the past. One thing I noticed about some of the students that we have nowadays, like, we're in a K-8 building, because it's a different time for them, social media, the interracial datings and marriages and all that, they don't see these issues. They feel like they're just like omnipotent. Oh, nothing's going to happen to me if somebody tries to do this. So I'm sure right now a lot of the kids are going through some type of trauma seeing these things happening on the news. So I think if we don't teach it, we're hurting them. Staying silent is definitely going to hurt them. They need to be prepared out there. Yes, it's going to be an uncomfortable conversation, but we need to present the truth, as it is.
I want to add on to that real quick, especially in a space where they might feel safe to discuss that. And they might have access to a social worker or people that they feel really connected to, that they can process that trauma and information. Thank you, Myra. Zach?
Yeah, so like going off of that, and often I think about like the content I'm teaching or like the topics we talk about, and whether or not it might be traumatic or whatnot. I try to position that as like me being a white teacher. I don't want to lecture them about it. I don't want to tell them about it. I try to have like a conversation, like a discussion where we're all talking and we're all like listening, where I'm learning, they're learning, everyone is communicating about it. That way it makes it a little bit easier, I guess, to talk about the traumatic. It's still difficult, but it opens it up and it allows the students to not only see you as like the authority figure who's like saying you basically, or like feeling like you know everything, and letting them know that like this is like an open space where everyone can communicate.
Thank you, Zach. Open space. All right.
I'd like to add something to that.
Okay.
Like when Kobe Bryant died, I was subbing at one of the East Kentwood middle schools, and I used that as an opportunity to let the kids share how they felt, to let them vent about his death. And, you know, we didn't have answers or anything. It was just that I gave them an opportunity to discuss it. And for teachers that want to talk about, like, let's say, what happened with George Floyd, and you're uncomfortable about talking about race, at least give them the opportunity to acknowledge it, that, you know, we had something horrendous happen. You know, how are you guys feeling? You know, let them talk and let them vent, and you don't have to really engage. You just let them know that you hear them. You know, and from your personal, and it was, don't patronize them with, you know, I don't understand as a white person, but I do feel your pain. Don't focus on the whiteness, you know, so much as letting them know that I hear you, I feel you, and this is a safe space in this classroom for us to talk about issues like that.
Okay. Thank you, Dana. Safe space is definitely, I think, the most important. I know that when we were talking about kids, especially Myra, or we were talking about Kobe Bryant during the school year, we got a lot of odd behavior from them. And I think it was because they felt safe to have that behavior. So thank you. All right, the time is 8:11. Kevin, I saw that your hand was raised, but I think you lowered it.
Yeah, I was only going to say what Dana already said, which is, you know, we don't need to go in and provide answers. We need to open up space for people to share their experiences and to be authentically listening, and to really come in, particularly I think if we're white, come in with a huge dose of humility, and put our egos aside and just be open to hearing about other people's experiences. So just reiterating what Dana already shared.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. Okay, so Erica, do you want to take us away?
Yes.
Right.
Sure. So the first thing I want to say is thank you so much to everyone for all the resources. I know I'm sitting here jotting down a lot of titles and articles and books that I need to read. So thank you all for sharing that information and that knowledge with us.
Erica, can you say that again? Oh, she must have been frozen. Okay, until she gets back on, I will close out the meeting and do some of my closing comments. I'm going to share all of the books, all of the curriculum, all of the resources that were shared in the chat box. I will share them in the Facebook group. I want to thank you so much, Kevin, Myra, Dana, and Maleika, for providing your perspective. And thank you so much for everybody that joined in and that wants to do this work. Erica and I could not have done this without you. That'd have been one boring meeting. So thank you so much for everybody. And please, there are surveys for the guests. Kevin, Myra, Dana, and Maleika, I emailed those to you. Please take that survey so that we can provide a better meeting experience. We can learn. To our group members that joined us, please take the survey. It's on the event invite. There's the WhatsApp chat. If you want to continue this conversation, you can get the link to the WhatsApp chat in the group event invite. If you have any questions for me or Erica, please PM me or put it on the group site. Next week, we're going to have the diatribe on. It'll be the same day, the same time, and we're going to be talking about creating those safe spaces for students, which was kind of mentioned here. And if there's anybody who wants to ask Kevin, Maleika, Myra, or Dana a question. If that's all right with my guests to stay on a couple more minutes, I want to honor your time, and I know this was a huge chunk of it. So if you have a question for them, stay on. But I believe I covered everything. This is recorded. I will be sending it to people who requested it. Take the survey. I love you all. Thank you so much, and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So if you're staying on to ask a guest a question, can you put your hand up?
Perfect.
Okay. So we have 3 people. Zach?
Oh, the others can go first. I'm totally cool with that.
Okay. Willow?
Yeah, this might be a little bit more of a pointed question, but for Maleika, I teach in GRPS. I teach at Burton Middle School. And this may just be my naivety, but is there resources that we could possibly have for our staff, for PDs? I really think that while we do have quite a few really awesome people in our building, Dana, you brought up a good point that it's not fair to just continue to seek out those people every time for wisdom, and I don't want to make them feel like I'm having them teach my classes or anything like that. I know that one of them is a student advocate, and so she has said previously that, you know, please call on me, like this is my job to be an advocate for our students. But again, I don't want to exhaust her either. We have 600 kids there. So Maleika, is there resources there in the district that I could have possibly come in and even just like have a small group discussion in my classroom? Or, you know, I would really like to have even just like a panel night where students could come and ask those questions, or their families could come and ask those questions to help navigate some of this.
Yeah. I think just email me and let me know when. I have an equity team, and we just got a little bit bigger. So we're working on some things for next year now. And we have been to a number of schools. We've done restorative circles in a couple schools, met with parents, and I know that I or a member of my group or several members of that group would love to be able to come in and do that with you and your students or the staff. The other thing is, if it's just staff, we started in the spring just before we had to exit early. These, we call them hashtag real talk. And so we have a series of 6 topics. We're bringing them back starting the fall. They may have to be virtual. We don't know. So it would look sort of like this, where we have a topic. So the one that we did was systemic racism the first time. And so we had a 15-minute conversation, and then we engaged the group of people who came in this conversation about it. So just email me and let me know what you want, and we'll make it work.
Definitely. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Katie?
This wasn't so much a question, but I just wanted to highlight, and it sounds like maybe we'll talk about this more at our next meeting. It's been on my mind since last week. But I thought Dana's points were very exceptionally valid when we were talking about the classroom management piece. And I think, like, historically, special ed has over-identified students of color for our populations, and I think like a big piece of that could honestly be like just not having that cultural awareness as, you know, a person who has white privilege, and so just being like more naive to the differences, and like we are expecting the kids to kind of follow our, you know, WASB, our school norms that weren't necessarily normal for others, if that makes sense. And I just think that's like maybe a huge piece to talk about in terms of like discipline and management.
I think that's an entire meeting in itself, honestly.
Yeah.
Noted.
Yeah. Thank you, Katie, for bringing that up. Debbie?
Sorry, you might hear a crying child run in here just a second. I wanted to go back to something Kaylin wrote in the chat, just how might we do all this in partnership with parents, because I believe they are essential to being a part of the conversation. And I know parents may feel something different when they step into the school, and I think we need to think about being, I don't know, open in these conversations about what needs to happen so that everyone feels welcome in the school, that people feel heard, seen, and that it's not just coming from a white middle class culture.
Thank you for echoing that question. I think that's definitely a question that, like a topic we could create a meeting around, because it's super important.
Sure.
Validating the parents, making them part of the school community, make sure that they feel heard and respected.
Absolutely. And I just want to jump in. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I just want to jump in and say, when I've been vulnerable and honest with the parents at my school, I let them know, hey, I really appreciate that you trust me. I really appreciate that you trust me with your children. Just that very brief, very vulnerable conversation in and of itself helps parents feel more comfortable having that conversation with me later.
Myra?
Yes, I like what Erica just said. That's Erica, correct? Yeah. But the other thing that I think is important, when we have parents in the building or guardians or caretakers, particularly, Black parents, I think it's important that we know how to address them that makes them feel comfortable. One thing that I notice quite frequently, even with parents that on my caseload, I always address the parents as Mr. or Ms. until they give me permission to call them by first name. I mean, I even have a situation now where a former student of mine, when I was a social worker at Riverside, is now a parent of mine. And I actually address her by her last name. And finally, she got to the point, she says, this is uncomfortable. You were my social worker. I says, but you know what? I'm giving you your due respect. But, even though I've brought up at meetings, look, you do not call someone old enough to be your grandparent by their first name. Because we are raised, you address someone as Mr. or Ms. But I think that's part of making them feel comfortable when they're in the building, giving them their due respect.
Thank you, Myra. I know you have told me that more than once. Kevin?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I often remind young teachers that they should always remember that parents are always their children's first teachers, and that we are actually there to support the work that parents are doing and caring for their kids. A second thing, and I'm really, again, just reiterating here, we have to be ready to build trust between ourselves and parents, particularly parents who themselves may have had traumatic experiences in schools. We can't say because they didn't show up or they didn't answer the phone the first time we tried, they don't care. I challenge the teachers that I work with to show me a parent or a caregiver who doesn't care about their child. And then related to that, the third thing that I tell them is you got to keep showing up. You just got to keep on keeping on, because again, it goes back to building trust. And if you're going to give up the first time, you don't really stand a chance.
Yeah, resiliency. Thank you, Kevin. Zach.
Yeah, so first off, that hashtag real talk, that was awesome. If anyone is at GRPS, definitely go and see those. I went to that first one, and it was very insightful, very helpful for better understanding stuff, just the dynamic. And then also, and not to put Dana on the spot, I was wondering if I can communicate with her outside of the chat about some semi-educational, not educational stuff, which totally fine if they don't want to answer, but yeah. And then going off of the parent thing is huge. That's one thing that next school year, I'm trying to get better at completely putting this making it so it's separate, then school and home is separate, isn't separate. It's like more combined, more like where the parents know you so much better or whatnot. Yeah.
Thank you. So, Zach, I will give you Dana's email address. Dana, that's okay?
Yep.
I know that I shared it. All right, awesome. So it is now 8:25. We went way over, but that is amazing. Thank you so much to everybody who stayed and asked questions.
I want to say something right quick.
Okay. Oh, Dana, you muted yourself.
If you guys need help, I'm available. I'm not under contract, so I could, you know, I'm available if you need help or someone to come in the classroom and help you talk with the students and do presentations. I'd also like to say that as Black Lives Matter, we have a Facebook page and we have over 500 people that predominantly white who are joining, and they're asking me what to do due to the uprisings, and they're angry at how the police injustice in response to Floyd and also Ahmaud when he was jogging. So we're planning to do some white allyship trainings, and like I said, they're asking me what to do, and I'm pretty much like, I'm not going to tell you what to do. You have to do your own work, but we're still going to have, you know, Facebook talks or Zoom discussions to help at least let them be able to ask questions, and I probably answer their questions. I want to hit back to what we were talking about the parents. A lot of, especially low-income parents, are dealing with severe economic issues and pressures, and they're just trying to make it in this world. And then they might have a student or their child that's problematic, and they don't have the time, or they don't have a job that they could quit or be able to take your phone calls, or they're too stressed out when they get home to have to deal with a teacher calling me about my child. They want to engage, but sometimes they can't. And then I have a friend who can't engage because of her criminal convictions. So she can't even come up into the school. She is heavily involved in everything else, but she can't come to the school. So, so that's an issue as well that we have to look at. And then a lot of the parents have had their own negative experiences with school. So the school is a form of trauma, because they weren't taught properly. And then lastly, you know, like, you know, me and Myra hit on that a lot of the kids don't have the formal education for you to really piggyback on. And the parents may not have it as well. So I would say, you know, don't want the parents to come to the classroom and be engaged, but a lot of times they can't, and it's for various reasons. That's all.
Thank you, Dana. Those were all very good points. Try to be as understanding and empathetic as possible. All right. Well, thank you again. Anybody who wants to stay on and ask Erica and I any questions, please feel free to do so. But for everyone else, thanks and good night. And I hope to see everybody. Yeah.
Good night. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Brittany, I'm going to go ahead and reclaim host real quick.
Okay.
All right, there we go.
All right.
We'll give everybody a second to. There we go.
I'm gonna stop. I think you need to stop recording.
Oh.
Oh wait,
Yes.
no, I do.
Oh, you